So a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming on time. Sorry we're starting a little late, but you need to give people a little bit of buffer time. My name is Rashmi Dhanwani. I'll be leading the session, moderating the session this evening. Just a quick check before we begin. How many of you work in the culture sector right now? I'll begin by giving you a little bit of a context of what we are trying to do and also introducing our panelists. Just a little bit about the structure of the event. What we are doing here today is about earlier this year, SDA Bocconi Asia in India, they supported us and commissioned a study on what are the challenges that people in the cultural sector are facing when it comes to accessing learning and training programs. And that white paper that emerged out of that, which is due to be published very soon, we're sharing some of those insights from that white paper and using this platform to trigger discussion around those insights. We do know that not too many of these discussions happen, so it will be great to get to hear from you at a certain point. Having said that, a few ground rules. The way we've structured the presentation is we'll be sharing insights and we'll be breaking the session up into these three areas: structures, roles, and pay scales. And there'll be conversations with our panelists for about an hour, after which we'll open it up for Q&A. So just that request. If you have any questions that you have, please take notes. If you need paper, pens, we all have them outside. There's enough supply. Otherwise, you've got your phones. So with that, I'd like to welcome all of you once again. Thank you so much for coming. Before I introduce my panelists, I'd like to take you through a little bit about the study and then get into introducing our panelists. So a little bit about the study, like I mentioned, it was initiated by, or rather commissioned by SDA Bocconi. And largely, we looked at covering cultural professionals, people who are working in the sector, but also students from the humanities and the arts sector. We also had a section of people who were not essentially in the culture sector but wanted to move in. People who were, we actually had air hostesses who wanted to sort of start working for a dance organization and things of that sort. So people who were looking for a career switch. What we did about 12 in-depth interviews of people who are coming from these backgrounds, as I just mentioned. We also did focus group discussions in Delhi and in Bombay. And we also had a public event, again in Delhi and Bombay. Some of you were there for that event, so I can see some familiar faces, where we unpacked some of these ideas of what are the challenges that people in the sector are facing. So all of those insights have been used in the study. These were the objectives of the study. Our focus was to identify the needs and the gaps that people who want to aspire to have a career in the arts, or arts management aspirants, and cultural professionals are facing in accessing learning in this space. The idea was to also understand what are the barriers that they are facing. I mean, I want to go abroad and you know, sort of do my master's, a massive MBA, but there's funding, there are all of those other issues that create challenges for us to access that kind of education. So we also unpacked what are the barriers that we're dealing with in accessing the same. And the idea was to also provide recommendations to both SDA Bocconi but also the sector at large to see what is it that you can do from here, given that these are the needs of people who are working in the sector. The output is going to be, or is, it's almost ready, is a research-led white paper which will be released next month. So a little bit about our panel. So I'd like to start by introducing Alessandro Giuliani. He is the Managing Director of the SDA Bocconi Asia Center. He's also been leading the SDA Bocconi IPAM program, which is the International Program in Arts Management, which started earlier this year. I think the second edition is due. He's also a serial entrepreneur and has built companies in Italy, Spain, China, and India. He's been in India for, what, 8 years now? 8 years. And leading the SDA Bocconi Asia Center for about 7 years out of that. Delivering a range of programs around business management mainly in Bombay, but also a co-program in Italy, right? Like 1 year in Bombay and part of the time in Italy. Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Alessandro. And just to also give you a sense of why do we have this panel together, apart from SDA Bocconi commissioning the study, I think it was also to bring in that international perspective of how the sector is looked at on a micro level, on a global level, and hence having your inputs here would be really valuable. I'd like to introduce Jagdip Jagpal, who is the Fair Director of the India Art Fair. How many of you know about the India Art Fair? Okay, quite a few. It's, of course, India's flagship art fair and one of the most important cultural events in the city of Delhi and on the cultural calendar of the country as well. So she has, I personally and greatly admire Jagdeep for what she's done, particularly in the last 2 years, repositioned and delivered the last 2 editions of the India Art Fair. She's responsible for the strategic and curatorial enhancement of the fair as well as expanding activities in India and internationally. She comes from a wide background and experience, over 30 years of international experience, leading various creative industries and being a part of various creative industries, including art and culture, publishing and media, luxury and fashion. Prior to moving to India, she has played an important role at UK not-for-profit institutions, including the UK South Asia Network, New North and South, initiated by Dr. Maria Balshaw. Her previous roles include managing international partnerships and programs at Tate. She is a former trustee of the Wallace Collection and Almeida Theatre in London and was an advisor to the New Arts Exchange, Nottingham. And since 2012, she's been on the development board of the Royal College of Art, London, and serves as the governor at the LSE, the London School of Economics, where she studied law. We have with us also Radha Mahendru. She is the Senior Curator and Program Manager at Khoj. She conceptualizes, plans and executes residencies, exhibitions, seminars and public programming for Khoj, along with members of the curatorial team. She's been working with Khoj since 2015, leading its socially engaged art practice and fundraising projects. She was the lead curator of the Aesthetic Warfare, Digital Earth, Khidki Festival, Landscape as Evidence, Artist as Witness, and her recent curatorial projects include This Must Be True, Asia Assemble, Voices from the Margins, Khidki Voice, and the Khidki Storytelling Project. She's the co-author of The Horizon as an Imaginary Line, a semi-fictional illustrated account of young Somali women's encounters as a refugee in India. She's also trained as a filmmaker from the Shrishti School of Art and Design, and hence not everybody who studies in the arts works in the arts, as we were just discussing. A lot of transitions happen from other sectors as well. And she has directed several independent projects and documentaries. She is interested in creative practices that intersect with ecology, gender, and digital humanities. And she's currently thinking about art and strategies of art making in the age of algorithms, digital infrastructures, and fake news. And we've got Shaleen Wadhwana. She has woven her academic and professional life extensively around the arts in the heritage sector. She's got degrees in BA History from Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi, an MA in Art History from SOAS London, and academic expertise in art appreciation from the National Museum Institute in Delhi. And she was awarded the Scholarship of Excellence for Cultural Heritage Law from the University of Geneva. She's a Young India Fellow, and she has presented her academic research on embedded histories in objects looted during the 1857 Great Uprising at University College London in England. Shaleen has also worked with various museums and galleries, ranging from the Heritage Transport Museum in Haryana to the Chemould Gallery in Mumbai. She curates art and heritage-based experiences for a wide spectrum of audiences, ranging from universities like Michigan and Harvard to NGOs like Slam Out Loud, institutions like the Tribal Development Board of the Government of Maharashtra, and the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. She is currently a visiting faculty of at the Design Management Department of MIT ID Institute of Design in Pune. She is also a humanities curriculum designer for the innovation program at the same university. And she's also been a curator. She's curated a show at Tark, worked across these spaces, but now occupies a position where she's an independent consultant. And therefore, the deliberate reason to bring these experts here to share their perspectives of how do you carve the space out for yourself. So that's our fantastic, stellar panel here today. So to begin with, like I said, we'll first share with you the insights from the white paper. We'll begin with gaps. Our research told us that the key gaps that the sector professionals came back with, first of which was the fact that just aren't enough adequate education options for us, for our needs, as compared to what exists globally in this space. Just to give you an example, we don't have a single degree in arts management. There are some diplomas and training programs that exist, but not with very limited life. Like I think Dakshina Chitra is one of them that's been around for 10 years, and in that time they've changed their format 3 times. There is the Art Think South Asia Fellowship. It's a fellowship, not a structured training program. You need to apply for it to get through. Recently, there are 2 programs that have emerged, one of which is SDA Bocconi Asia Center. It's a short learning program, a short-term study tour and a project. It's a 3-month program. And the IMA Cultural Entrepreneurship Program. But still sparsely, far and few in between from a managerial point of view. Of course, you've got programs which are content-heavy from an artistic practice perspective, or you've got so the short training programs in Jnana Pravaha on Indian arts and aesthetics and art history and all of those, largely focusing on practice as opposed to managerial contexts. But broadly, this is what exists. Also, there aren't enough avenues for accessing these opportunities. Like, I don't know how many of you know that there are all of these options that even exist. So we don't have a common platform we can access this kind of information. There isn't enough sector knowledge as to what's going on in the sector, who's got the plum job that you thought someone should apply for, what are the kind of job opportunities that exist that you should be applying for. We don't, this is what the respondents told us as well, that there isn't a sense of how do you grow in the sector, some of which we hope to unpack today. There were also skill gaps in specific areas that were identified, but given the respondents a range of options. These were the top 4: strategic planning and general management, financial planning and fundraising, marketing and audience development, and technical and production skills. As I was mentioning, we looked at 3 very clear groups of people who shared their insights and their needs. So these are the needs that they spoke of. Part of it is repetitive from what I've said in terms of the gaps that they've outlined, but they really felt that they needed more formal training programs that they could make use of, but also within the organization some structured processes, because a lot of the learning happens on the job. Mentorship and skilling was a huge gap or need that they identified, and wider knowledge of the art market and the cultural sector. For people who are not from the arts sector and want to move into the sector, sector knowledge became a big area that they felt they needed to understand better, and of course mentorship and expert guidance. And for students or people who are, particularly students who are master's students, masters in humanities, arts, literature, they really felt that they needed to understand what the art market looks like and what the culture sector looks like if they want to sort of make a career in this space. These are some of the barriers that have been identified for cultural professionals who are already working. They mainly spoke about if we have to go abroad and do an arts management program, how relevant it is to our reality. That was one major area. Of course, a high monetary investment. It's not. It's going abroad and studying is no child's play. Scholarships are far and few in between. And one very interesting thing was also value for money. If I'm putting in that kind of money, if I'm going abroad, what is my return on investment? How can I make that money back? What kind of salaries will I get when I come back? And lack of clarity, general clarity around that, which makes them question whether they should even be accessing an upskilling opportunity, or whether a formal training program abroad even makes sense for them. For professionals from a related field, it was largely about they just didn't know what existed. There was very little awareness of what kind of programs even existed, and yet at the same time, no accessible knowledge and guidelines about how do we navigate the sector. How is the sector stable enough for me to make that switch? Any information that give them the confidence to take that decision. And of course, we've already mentioned the mentorship and apprenticeship programs and the fact that they don't exist. So before we move into that, I'd just like to hear from you, given that these are all the gaps, needs, and barriers, is there any response that you'd like to share, anything that you'd like to add to this, your perspective, or should we just move on to the structures?
I think one thing that people have to accept is that the arts sector here and the culture sector generally is very fragmented. And ordinarily, a number of opportunities or formalities or structures or benchmarks, way of doing things would come through, as they do internationally, through part government-funded public institutions. I mean, certainly that's where the core of the workforce comes from in different parts of the world, and then that is added to by all the other different aspects that work around the cultural sector. So I don't think it's possible here to suddenly create that. But that's not to say that it's not possible to tackle some of these issues, because one of the greatest needs that we have, and I run an art fair, and I have this also with my colleagues who run festivals and various activities, there aren't enough people who are interested or have some work experience around the functions which are not curatorial and not conservation, etc. So.
Yeah, just to say that I feel like I think one of the things that happens, and I think that especially comes with higher education, is that almost all knowledge, and especially that which is done abroad, is very theoretical. And the thing is to realize any kind of intellectual idea also that you have to physically manifest it, which requires people skills, which requires certain sense of production. You should be able to get up and clean the bench if you have to yourself. And I mean, there are lots of things required to actually actualize that project. And I think those are things which are not formally taught to us, and therefore when you enter a job, you don't imagine that to be a part of your role. Coupled with the fact that most of our roles anyways are not clearly defined. If I had to say what my role at Khoj is, it's very hard to say, okay, it starts here and it ends here. And you kind of have to pick it up. Even small things like emailing, it's something that it took me a long time to understand how do you deal with every kind of situation. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation where you need mentorship to be able to build these skills, but at the same time I see how these have to be built only if you work enough to get experience. So
it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, but I imagine like maybe like 3-month internships. Like one of the things that has really worked, I think, for a lot of people who are interested in a career in the arts is actually a fellowship program. It actually came from this need where people felt that a 4 to 6 week internship wasn't good enough. And we agree, because for us also to be able to like induct someone into our daily activities, before you know it, that time is over. So a 6-month fellowship allowed for that kind of like mutual benefit. And I think something like that, or like a shorter program, is a great way to go.
I think I just want to stress on even the practical or vocational courses that exist abroad as well. You're quite right about the relevance point. I think that's the crucial point. So even if someone goes on to do a semester course, a summer course, can afford a degree either through a loan or through scholarship, one of the major things is that all the art business degrees and all the museum, gallery, and curating based degrees that are offered in multiple quote-unquote Western cities are also very relevant to a developed Western market. So even if I'm studying logistics and art handling, but I'm studying it in a very developed Western market, it's up to me if I can apply it back within an unorganized sector that India has. But if I can't, then that is a wasted degree that has actually no return on that investment. And having been through asking for a loan for an art history degree and been denied from every bank in India, that's also a big catch-22. So you're not going to get a loan for these degrees outside. So you're stuck. And that's why there has to be a lot more impetus within India to create relevant degrees, or at least within partnerships within India and abroad to create relevant degrees that tackle the South Asian context, which is something SDA has also started looking at. So that is the way to go.
Okay, so I think, yes.
Yeah, so I totally agree what you were all saying. And in fact, bringing the arts management program to India needed some kind of adaptation. I think that it relates again to what I was saying before, that the market is still under development. And we had the first auction houses in Europe in 1770, I think. And the first one here was in 1936, if I remember well. So it's still in the making. The market is fragmented, is unstructured. So we do need, I think we strongly need some kind of structuring in the thinking and also in the very basic skills that you were saying. Those are all parts of these executive programs. But you do need a lot of ground in the last mile in India. That's why in our program we called all the top guys of art in India, at least for the legs of in Mumbai and Delhi, because it is strongly needed. It's a bridge from the Western, more structured logistics and so on to the actual situation in India. So this is where we will be in some time. You are trained also for that, but now this is what it is.
Some of the biggest employers are fairs and festivals across the country. I mean, we know of the biennales and various other events. It doesn't always have to be visual arts. It can be literature, it can be music, it can be many other things. And also, you've got to remember that many artists now run artist studios. So their roles within artist studios was assisting the artist with their actual work, or whether it's to do with managing their output.
So artist studios, the fairs and the biennales, so basically event-driven organizations, which you're right, we missed out on that. And actually earlier on when we were talking, one of the other organizations that I missed was actually education institutions. Surprise, surprise. We completely missed out on that. So that's another type of organization that exists in the sector. Is there anything else that you'd like to?
I think I definitely have to add how technology is disrupting every industry. So you have specific social media companies dedicated for promoting art. So that's a very new niche, circumstance-driven company coming in. So there are those as well, and of course more ancillary.
So would that fall into the service businesses area, so to speak, to a certain extent? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think publications, online as well as physical publications, but I would also just probably put it out there that another way of thinking about the roles or the structures could be actually from the kind of work that is done, because that then this kind of categories are not required, but actually closer to the conversation we're having. If you look at exhibition design, marketing, social media, writing, then the groupings turn quite different, and actually that gives another kind of perspective onto what kind of role you can play in that space, fundraising.
Okay. And perhaps that could be unpacked when we get to the role section, because that's another lens to look at and sort of reduce the disorientation that we feel when we're trying to figure out what the sector looks like or the composition of the sector is. And just connecting that to categories, we have to reorganize this and think about the kind of categories that exist. We've, at least for the purpose of this discussion, looked at private, public, mixed and not-for-profit. We'll just expand that a little bit. So when you look at a public and a not-for-profit area, with public you're looking at a government-aided or government-run organization. So let's say a national museum or an NGMA, or for that matter even ASI, becomes that kind of a public institution or structure. And the not-for-profit becomes your charitable trusts, foundations, and Section 8, or is it Section 25, not-for-profit? I keep forgetting which one they've switched to, but it's one of those. But the not-for-profit company, that would come under that. Private and mixed would be, private could be looked at as for-profit, so your service organizations could potentially go in that. Even to a certain extent, events, depending on if the event comes under the for-profit aegis or a not-for-profit aegis, differentiating between that. And the mixed, which would be the public-private and a foreign-owned context. Public-private examples being the Bhaudaji Lad Museum, which is a product of a PPP, public-private partnership between the Bajaj Group, Intac, and the BMC, in Bombay, the corporation. Yeah, Intac itself is a PPP. So that's unique in our context in some sense. Any thoughts on anything more that we could add, remove, restructure? We can also move on. Yeah.
I think it comes down to what Radha said earlier, is if you look at it from the other angle, which is what are the different types of functional expertise that are required, because irrespective of if it's a public organization or a for-profit like we are, marketing, finance, project management, legal, all of the production, all of those aspects apply in different ways and to different degrees. So when it comes to looking for a career in the arts, whether it's the first group that you described, which is people who are already working in the cultural sector, is for them to research and look at it in that broad way, as opposed to saying, or I won't work for anything that's not a not-for-profit. I'm not, because they can't really be passionate about the arts in the way that I am. When you then come to the second group that you described, which is career changers, actually career changers are very successful at moving into the arts because they have transferable skills. And if they can manage that and do the good research and able to demonstrate how those skills can transfer to the roles that they're taking on, it's been very effective. We hire a lot of career changers. And then when it comes to people who've recently graduated or are about to graduate, I think there's a couple of things. Is they don't actually know what these different functions are like. So that's where it's important for them to get working experience in whatever area before they decide to do, they actually decide they want to work in the arts, and they decide that they're going to cough up money or take a loan to go and do an arts management degree. Because personally, I wouldn't do an arts management degree unless I knew I was going to get a placement. And I was going to get a placement in an organisation that was going to respect me and train me as part of that compact with the group that were actually giving the arts management degree. And then the other side of that for students, which is incredibly important, is something that applies to every single sector, which is how do you find a job? It's not just how do I find a job in the arts sector. It's what plan and process do I have to follow to find a job? What can I reasonably afford to do? Can I afford to move? Can I not afford to move? And then take that and say, what research do I have to do? How do I find out which are the best places to go to the people who employ? And you take it every step like that. And then even down to, how do I write my CV? And how do I contact an organisation? How do I present myself? We have this quite often. I think Gautami's here. When anybody applies to us and says, I'm really good at communications, we look at their CV and instantly I'll say, your CV's just proved that the last job you should be doing is communications. So that is something, I think, to think about, which goes across all sectors.
So I'm going to actually move on very quickly from this section because clearly our panel has decided don't look at structure, try and look at it from the perspective of roles. And perhaps that last question about the role that a formal program or training plays in your growth, we'll move that as we are discussing roles. Dipti, can we move on to the types of careers and roles? So this was our way of approaching it. We talked about two macro ways of looking at it. One is more content-specific skills, and the other is the managerial, transversal or transferable skills. And the content-specific, we of course look at curation, collections management, research, conservation, education and outreach, where you require some amount of content-based training to be able to perform in these roles adequately. And then you've got the management transversal skills, which is marketing, communications, management, production, event management, human resource management, administration, and those types. So let's try looking at this lens, and let's, Radha, from your perspective, since you are actually coming very heavily from the content-specific space, what you just spoke about, if you look at it from the role perspective, how is it that you would look at career growth in the content-specific skill area? What do you think some of these roles require to grow in that direction? You could pick any one, but just as an example for us to think about, how do we grow in these roles? What is it required for you? What happens initially? How do you grow? What is it? What kind of support do you require to get better at your work?
That's a tough one. I would also say that for me, so many of these are like interlinked. Even in my current role, I can see so many things are linked. For example, what's curation without production? And then there are these middle crossover skills which are hard to clearly define as being content specific or management. Like we discussed earlier, exhibition design or fundraising or PR. Or like, for example, in the arts itself, there's a very, very big potential, and there's already a lot of work around archiving and cataloging. And within that also there are content-specific skills, and then there are those in management. But I think over here what's interesting to see is that actually, because the scene is not so defined, there is actually scope to grow a lot within each of them. It actually very much depends on to what Shaleen was also saying, on the place that you're in and how you respond to that situation. And also it's, for example, at Khoj, till about 5 or 6 years ago, there was only program managers and curators, and then the director. So I think with one of my colleagues, I think she's here, past colleague, Shatara, when she was, in the third year or something, they felt a need that there has to be something else, because how do you grow? And it's not like you're not growing in the work that you're doing or how you're contributing, but there is no way to kind of give it its credit or give it its due. So I think that has also started happening in a lot of organizations, where you're actually creating that leadership pyramid, so as to speak, where you're actually identifying the work that someone is doing, which is greater, and they have grown in the organization, but you haven't found a way to kind of validate it or like appraise it. So I think that is one thing, and I don't know if I've answered your question or not. The other thing that I think what happens is that, at least for us, like we were recently hiring people for 2 more roles. It's very, very hard to see, okay, if someone has done ABC work experience, if they come from this kind of specialization, will they be a good curator and program manager at Khoj? Because again, the skills are so varied. So I think it also depends person to person how much you end up taking on, and what is that A++ that you do, and how that plus defines the organization while you're there, and how do you then in turn grow with it. I don't know if that...
I'm just going to pick from what you said. I think one of the things you said is you are able to perform across various roles, which could cut across both content specific and transversal, and you're able to achieve a certain amount of excellence, but that's not validated. And the validation could come from appraising as formal appraisals or position. What are the parameters of that validation that you are?
I mean, I wish I could answer that, because it's not that formalized, I think. And I think especially for, like I have colleagues who are also curators in the larger ecosystem, where there is a lot of, I would say, social capital or other kind of validation mechanisms. But if you look at their precarity, where their financial sustainability is concerned, it's pretty much the same that it's been for the last 5 or 6 years. So whereas someone else who was not a curator, but in other kinds of art jobs, they have a lot more of a steady growth in some ways, but may not be this satisfied in the same way. So it's a very tricky thing, and I don't think it's been formalized so much in our spaces to be able to even clearly say that, okay, this happened because of this, and this is how you know.
So let's look at another lens. Alessandro, you've of course dealt with it from a much more formal structure in the corporate sense. How would you look at that validation in maybe a slightly more formal setup? I'm just seeing if there's another lens that we could use to look at it. Like if you were running Khoj, Pooja is going to kill me, but if you were running Khoj, how would you address this validation? What are the parameters, given the intangibility of what you're talking about? Where does this validation come from? Finance being one, roles, I don't know, maybe a position.
Yeah, well, for corporate world, more structure, finance is always the base one, but not only that, for sure. As I was saying before, especially with the younger generations, it's about career path, about learning. So we were talking about continuous learning. That's something that's very much appreciated and helps you grow, especially, as we were saying, in a sector that is developing in India. So you don't know exactly where it will go. In a country where technology is extremely strong, where scale is extremely important, so technology will be even more important. I think that's another area which could be interesting also in this sector.
So again, I'm just, and I'm going to come to you, but I want to get into, Jagdip's structure at this stage. So again, I'm just connecting the dots. You're talking about being able to perform well or under several roles within the same organization. The validation could be finance, could be continuous learning. And you have actually attempted that, Jagdip. We were earlier talking about within your organization, you addressed ways of enabling that learning by getting external expertise, the social media one being example. Would you just like to share that with us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the starting point is just to say that FAIR 2018, 2019, we're going to FAIR 2020, and about 50% of our core team came in as interns. So they got to learn how to survive in a live environment. And then the key thing that struck me was that you have to make a decision. about whether to train the people that you have with you or take the risk of bringing in people who say they have the skills and experience, but you have no real understanding of it. So having worked in a very difficult live environment, that's where we picked up. So as an example, we made decisions. So there are people within my team, the Director of Exhibitor Relations, Director of External Relations and Outreach, which I felt I could train myself. Then there's our Head of Communications and Marketing, and particularly in the social media area, where it's not an area where I could train the individual myself, except in project management, contractual things and finance. So we actually made sure that we actually brought in some expertise by hiring somebody internationally who had a track record of not only delivering results in social media, but also of training people. So they weren't just a big name because they sit on a lot of panels, but that is a track record. And the impact that I had was the person that we chose to undertake that training was somebody who had incredible communication skills, as it were, was also somebody we knew that would share the training and share the knowledge with our other colleagues, and also is something that individual would enjoy progressing and the challenges that it brings. So we went from somebody who was an intern to somebody who's now on the management committee and is head of communications, marketing and social media. Luckily for that individual, her work is very visible. So it's very easy for people to say, oh my God, who did the website, who did the content creation? And even now, every day, every time we do things, she's learning to make a film, learning to do first-hand research into contemporary art and various things. There are other roles that are not so, the outputs are not so visible. So it's also one of the reasons that everybody is, it's better to train people so that I can delegate and then spend more time myself trying to look at other sort of macro issues. But that's also one of the reasons we describe all of our output as a team effort. So that should anybody within the team look for a role outside of the organisation, because we also accept that there's going to be a limit to how far people can progress. Although we do try to challenge people and promote people every year, it means that they also can say honestly that they were a part of the team that delivered the fair, and we will reinforce that.
You bring up a very interesting point, and taking it to Shaleen and your journey, having worked for a relatively more formal organization into now being a consultant, what Jagdip touched upon is the initiative of the individual. How can that person to whom you're giving training both take that training and pass it on, which has to do a lot with what you spoke about, the initiative that the person takes both to engage with continuous learning, but also to pass that on within the team. So would you like to share your experience with that, and how and why is that important in sort of taking ownership of your learning and growth as well?
Totally. The gallery that I was hired by before was called Chemold, and I was handling sales and strategy for them. One of the major things that I really wanted to institutionalize was a handover system. So once my 3-year contract was over, the person who was replacing me was 1.5 months being trained by me, and that was a template that I left there that is still being used. But that's one example, which is decidedly based on the person's personal initiative. I think the other word I want to add in this conversation is incentivization, which ties in everything that we've all said so far, because a lot of the audience here is within their late 20s, early 30s. And I find that for that spectrum of quote-unquote millennial to be able to sign 3 to 5 year contracts is a bit of a heart attack. So how do you retain that talent? All of the ways to retain that talent have already been expressed here, which is, you're training them, you're making their work visible, you're validating them. Sometimes it's not simply just the salary, because what happens with a no middle management industry is that you're entering the title and designation that you're likely going to be in maybe even 5-10 years down the line, because there is actually no tier 2 cross. So then what's going to incentivize you if not a typical formal industry designation growth? It probably is salary, it probably is validation, it probably is the investment that your organization places in you. How many training sessions do they send you for? And these are things that definitely Jagdip has lived through. So therein you have the team of India Art Fair as well. So those are one of the major things. And the on-the-job training, there are merits to that, but then there are also limitations and stagnation. So how do you kind of challenge yourself there and keep moving through all of the things that everyone's mentioned here?
But Shaleen, just to touch upon your own experience, you're now a consultant. How do you engage with continuous learning? And are there enough avenues for individuals who want to sort of go in that pathway, but may not have the formalized, on-the-job, in some sense, in-house training, which institutions can even conceive of having for their employees, which you may not get the opportunity to. So how do you go about that?
True. From my personal experience, what I can account for is everything that I'm doing for the last year, which is writing, curating, designing curriculum, teaching, and conducting walks and tours, and also consulting with early stage art startups. To do this broad spectrum set of skills was primarily related to the 3 years of sales experience that I've had and the 1 year of programming and marketing I've done at a museum. I had no option but to transfer these skills to be able to do this because I wanted to remain within arts and probably have diversified to culture and heritage as well. But to remain within this space, to be able to earn, quite frankly, and sustain myself there, it required diversifying and it required passing and not even knowing and recognizing suddenly, okay, this is a skill set that I have. So a lot of it is just transferring skill sets that you have, and probably Radha is the best example of coming from a filmmaking background and really utilizing that in a completely different setup, but maybe that's not just completely different. Also, more courses would be great for exec ed.
So, I mean, actually, listening to everyone has been really interesting because I think a productive exercise would be that actually if we thrash down everything that we all do in our daily lives, and I think a lot of people over here, this is going to be filled up a lot more.
Yeah.
And then that also helps you formalize whatever skills you have. And I think that's super important because that also becomes a way of, again, getting that sense of satisfaction. That, okay, I came into a space, this is what I was doing, now I can do these many things. But the thing is that our formal roles, because of the kind of institutional histories that we have, or the ones that we borrowed from the West, we still have certain ways in which we compartmentalize and organize the work that we're doing. But I think there's a potential over here to break it down because then it also becomes more accessible to others to try and make that crossover.
Right. That's very interesting. We can move on to the next slide because I know there's some insights from the interviews. So one is, of course, the fact that the training that you come with if you're studying abroad, it differs vastly from the ground realities. And as you've all spoken about, you're actually doing multiple roles, which is not necessarily the way more formal structures work in the West. So that is one reality that you've just shared. And the other is that application of whatever you're learning becomes a key challenge because it seems to be so informal and to constantly bring in other learnings into your work. But one thing, and this was something that someone said in our interviews, is that I've had to wing it and learn everything on the job, and they desire someone guiding and teaching them. From here, just a couple of trigger questions. You've already mentioned that growth path looks, we've sort of covered that, but this second question is what I wanted to tackle is, clearly, as you've mentioned, a lot of these roles require multitasking and development of several skills. So it's not necessarily the training that you come with, but also what you learn on the job and what you add to it. What are your thoughts on specialization versus general roles? Is it good to continue in our reality, continue to be a generalist, as you've all evidenced and spoken of so highly? And if yes, what is the merit of specialization? Is that something we should even be aspiring towards as a sector? And I'd like to first begin with you both. Coming from the macro picture and the spaces that you occupy.
I think if I look at the three categories again, I think with people who are already working in the cultural sector, they get a sense for what they like, what they don't like, which areas they would prefer to be working in. So I think that will drive whether or not they specialize or not, because it is important to be an expert in one thing, but also have that general picture as well. I think for people who are career changers, it's very important with these transferable skills that you are very clear about what you think you can bring to the organisation and which area you want to focus on. Simply not good enough to come in and say, you know what, I make a great general manager, make me a general manager. Because you simply won't have the knowledge across those different areas and across the art forms and those various things. So I think for a career changer to come in, sometimes a career changer comes in a finance or other role, but then they find their feet, and because they deliver to such a high level, people respect them and allow them to move into other roles. And then, of course, for students, people who have recently graduated, you know, you've got to get the experience where you can. I think that's very important. I also think what Shaleen was saying is about the different things she does. It's also what makes Shaleen highly employable. So I would not expect her to be unemployed, because it does. Because if you can cover off, if you're prepared to do this, I mean, normally people say it's beneath them to start still doing tours and walks and various things to different groups. But actually, I think that is what makes her a very talented, highly employable person. And I think when you're in the freelance area, wherever you are in the cultural sector, you've got to remember that you have actually got to make an effort to make yourself as a highly attractive, highly employable candidate. So whether that's your temperament, it's how you behave professionally, or the fact that you're prepared to roll up your sleeves and get things done and not whinge every time, you know, something doesn't go your way. You know, all those sorts of elements. Doesn't matter if you're the most senior person or if you're the most junior person. I think that's the kind of thing that keeps most senior people going. I think the other thing you have to remember is in terms of management, like Radha said, the organizations aren't big enough to have a CEO, a COO, an artistic creative director. So, you know, you have to look at whether a curator's career path is then to end up as a manager, senior manager, or a fair director, all those different kind of, or through conservation. If you specialize in conservation, you're very much going into a very deep area of expertise, and it's fantastic because there's not too many people doing it, which means you'll always be employed. So I think it is that as well. We don't have these big structures that we can climb up, but at the same time you have to hedge your bets a little bit, because if the sector changes and it turns into a different type of thing swing in a particular way, it means that Radha's experience of marketing, finance, project management will mean that she'll be employed, because you've got to evolve as well. So you want to make sure you've got as many skills, but you've got expertise in a core skill.
So actually, Alessandro, with that, what we've sort of witnessed so far and heard so far is that the sector is very shallow, and I don't mean that in a negative way. In terms of the layers, the number of layers that we have, there aren't that many. So it's clearly not as layered as the corporate sector or a massive conglomerate or an MNC. And at the same time, it's, as you were saying, it's important to have that experience across several roles. You can sort of hold on and chip in, which makes you more employable. But at the same time, to develop that depth of expertise. Given that this is the reality of the sector, how and what would you value across specialization in the generalist space? And what would you see as a good way for a person to grow and the sector to grow?
For me, the reply between specialization and generalization is both. You need them both. As an attitude, as a general preparation, you need to be general, okay? Especially because of the shallowness of the sector, you have to be able to adapt, to know a little bit of everything. Okay? Having said that, once you get into a structure, you are put in a job that may suddenly change, because in small structures, also what you are doing changes, so you have to be adaptive. And so learning, being ready to learn and focus on something and passion, and do everything with passion, which is what we try to teach somehow. And now also in the selection, you're saying that she's highly employable. That's how we select people that have had diverse experiences, if they've had work experience, or if they're freshers that have done a lot of things. But a lot of things, if someone tells me I'm a tennis player and they've started 1 month back, so that doesn't count, because many people do that before the interviews for the jobs, for the programs. So when we see that there is consistency in playing a sport or in a cultural activity, and diverse interests during the course of life, I think that's the best thing. So train yourself to have diverse experiences, and then focus with passion on specific things once you have a general management background.
So essentially, it's also a matter of, as you said, attitude and evidence of seeing that in your career that you've been consistent and yet you've had interest and done work across several spaces, and that would therefore be a competitive advantage for you in terms of that growth path, right, as compared to...
For sure, and the sector is changing fast, and you have to be able to grasp the opportunity. I think that's the beauty also. If you have a general preparation, the beauty of the sector right now in India is that also entrepreneurship potentially is a very interesting career path. There will be many jobs, different jobs opening, from tech jobs to more totally non-tech jobs. Everything can change, everything can happen. And so those attitudes are much more important than the rest, I think.
Okay. And just to address this both to Radha and Jagdip, from your perspective, what kind of training can institutions give to their employees to perform to that level, given that they may not have the capacity or even the money to opt for a formal program? What can you do in-house to help facilitate that growth that we were talking about?
Well, I think there's some general basic things that everybody needs to do in any job is basic project management, and also the tools and things that go around that, whether that's spreadsheets or what have you. I think there's also teaching people that you can have to do is negotiation. And then I think when it comes to very specific areas that people need to learn, you do actually need to be in a live environment, ideally with somebody who's done that role before. So I would never put somebody in a role where there was no one there to try and assist or help them with it. And I think that's a very important thing, because most things you learn from the person who hired you or the person that you're working with. This idea that you can just work it out. Yes, you can work it out sometimes and you can just wing it. But then the next time you have to do it, and the next time you have to do it after that, you're not necessarily efficient. But really, in any organization, if it's working, there should be things that people can learn from each other. And there's also this thing that people have to do is they have to maintain their own knowledge level. So it's particularly in the arts, there's no point sitting at home and then saying, I'm not meeting people, I don't know a great deal is. You have to make the effort to go out. I know it's difficult because it's expensive to travel, but go out and see as much art as you can, go to lots of different things, go to lots of free talks that you can get into. But it is that, partly it's on the individual and partly it's on the person that's hired you to actually deliver that for you.
I think she covered most of it, but I think it's been interesting at Khoj because actually the way the organization started, it was not an institution. It was a lot more informal, and I think it kind of grew into that institutional role. So what that institutional knowledge is also actually with people, and it's taken some time for it to be somewhat formalized or documented. But I think increasingly a lot of focus has been put on making some kind of systems towards it. So actually for the first time 3 weeks ago, Khoj has hired a media and communications manager. And this came after realizing that there was a big gap in one of the things that we were doing, but kind of doing it on the side. But there was actually a role that was identified as being very, very important. Now, with this person joining in, we're actually now constantly focusing on coming up with a strategy, which then can be, done by even a fellow who's assisting them. That's one of the things. The other thing we do is with every new employee is that, or an intern or a fellow, is that we kind of attach them to specific projects. And then you are kind of working with the main person who's leading it. So first identifying who's leading it and who's seconding it, and then kind of breaking it down into different things. Having group meetings. I think communication has been, I think, one of the most important things. We just instituted Slack, and that's like a first for Khoj. So there are some things that are happening, I think, which are helping put some systems in place. We have a certain way in which we introduce people to the history of Khoj, and I think those kind of things are helping. To what Jagdip was saying and what was being discussed earlier, I think there's also what the beauty of the arts is that it allows you to kind of more obviously understand a need for an interest or a curiosity towards a specific thing. That could be a skill-based thing, that could be an intellectual or a research interest or something. And that's something that you'll only realize if you do a lot of different kinds of things I think this happens in every career. It's just that with the arts, it's a lot more out there. And I think, like for me, what's really been helpful is that because I've done a lot of things, and this is only I've realized is retrospectively, it's not like there was a plan, is that because I'd done a bunch of things which were completely different, I was able to realize what I don't like, and that itself was important enough. And then if you have a focus or an interest, then even those general skills together make a specialization. I don't think you need to commit to a specialization and then deep dive into it.
So just a couple of things I'm picking from what you're saying. One is, of course, the fact that there is this informality allows you to explore different facets. So in some sense, structure can be suffocating. As the organization gets more formalized and you talk about sustainability for a longer period, systems have to come in. So structure in it, manages to get into the way in its own way. And hence what you're talking about is it's the structure that creates the specialism or the need for that specialized role, because you don't have an option anymore. So maybe perhaps it's not, structure may not be the first step, it could be the informality, but eventually you need to get to a point where the institutional knowledge is systemized for sustainability, right? And that's where the role of in-house learning can play to drive systems, but also at the same time to document these learnings for other people to take away from. So it's not just at that on-the-job level. Yeah, I'm just sort of reading the undercurrents. Just to sort of move on to the next slide. Sorry. Getting to the money, honey. These are some of the insights that we got. So now that, sorry, just to sort of collect, because there's a lot that is being said, so I'm just trying to sort of consolidate everything. We've just covered structures very broadly to think about how the sector is looked at, and everybody sort of dispelled that myth and said, no, we should look at roles, but somehow we've sort of come back a little bit to structure, so I'm quite happy about that. But going further beyond passion, beyond building, it's also about survival. And that was one of the key insights that, of course, is there ever present everywhere, but also in the arts, which is not really as formally funded. The motivations for being in the arts are not always for profit. We don't really have a policy that guides the way we should function. So given these realities, the fact is that we do not have adequate pay structure, the structures aren't adequately categorized, there are low salaries, everybody complains about not having enough funding, and this is the reality that we exist in. This is also obviously what came through in our research, that they felt that they can't enter the sector because they're not going to, get that kind of pay. We all know most of our parents would have dissuaded us from entering the sector because of this reason. Career kaise banaoge? And also connected to that is the fact that because of this informality, we do not have avenues where we can get this information. So our parents don't know what our starting salaries are going to be like, which contributes to the lack of legitimacy of the sector. As well. And this again came through very strongly in the insights, that there is no standardization, there is no publicity of placement, pay and pay scales, and a sense of what the career in this could look like. Someone here earlier who came to me said they do career counseling, but arts is not what they look at, and I hope that person is still here somewhere. I'd love to hear from that person at some point later about what you think about some of these insights and the kind of guidance that parents would be looking for. But one very important thing that came through, and I hope we can unpack that as well, is the question of privilege. The fact that there isn't a legitimacy to this career as compared to some of the other careers, and there's no clarity on pay scales, is what means, what it results in is that a lot of people cannot access this as a career, and therefore only those with privilege or with other revenue sources, so to speak, can access. So it sort of creates an unequal entry into the sector as well, some of the insights that came through. And just to sort of move into a couple of trigger questions. So I know this is a sort of broad structure that we put together, just to understand what does it look like when we're starting out, what kind of salaries should we have from say 1 to 3 years, what could a mid-level salary be? We have nothing, so the questions is basically we have nothing, and these are not prompt questions for them. But one of the things that we also spoke about is professional skills and education requirements at each level, because we've mentioned that there's on the job, there is in-house training, what more? Here I'd also like to touch upon a little bit about, you spoke about professional skills in particular, so analytical thinking, communications, how to write an email, all of those things that are not formal training, but you're required to be able to grow and demand that sort of higher salary, increase increase the breadth of your employability, so to speak, in that sense. We can move on to the next slide. And also I'd like us to just sort of think about a little bit when you're talking about pay scales is how is it different for employed professionals given all of these informal structures, but also for freelancers and consultants. So how do you calculate what is it that you should be charging or what is it that you should be paying someone? So it would be great to hear from you also from an institutional perspective, like what are the thoughts, how do you articulate some of these dilemmas, and moving therefore on to the trigger questions, is just your response on the lack of data on published pay scales and how does it complicate the way you would look at some of these questions within your own organization or your own ways of working. And the second is, how do you recommend, can one navigate and survive in this sector?
Well, I think there are some salaries that are published, and I think if people want to show their parents what they are, and then their parents will tell them to go and get a job somewhere else, is in the national museums. So yeah, I think you have to have a master's degree, and then you earn a wage whereby you probably can't even afford to travel to work every single day. So that is the only sort of published salaries that we see. Amongst the commercial organizations, particularly auction houses, they will never share that information because it's commercially sensitive and it will encourage poaching. Similarly, amongst the galleries, as an art fair, we have a sense of what different gallery assistants and salespeople are paid, but again, it varies drastically. When it comes to the pay that we pay at India Art Fair, first of all, even though our financial model is tight, every single intern gets their costs covered of food and travel, and we provide food as well to make sure that they're not out of pocket by coming and working for us for a couple of days or for a week. What we've done is we've extended it now that some people we only brought in for a week, we're bringing them in for a month so that we can give them a proper salary. Some people we only brought in for a month, we brought in for 3 months so that we can give them a proper salary. When I set salaries, I always use the rule that if I stay in a luxury hotel in Europe, I would pay the same price for staying in a luxury hotel in India. Because I wouldn't think to myself, oh, because it's India, it must be cheaper. So I do keep a sense of what kind of salaries people, I have to bear in mind what kind of salaries people need to earn to live and eat and actually be able to do things so they can deliver the role. So it's really about the output. How much is that activity worth to me and the overall fare? So I do, in my mind, take account of European salaries. And I think we probably pay better than some. We pay less than obviously these large commercial organizations. But in order to retain people, we need to be able to make them feel that they don't need to be worrying about whether they can afford an Uber into work in the morning. And like I said, a lot in the arts is about what you do in your personal time as well, about what books you can buy, about what things you can go and see, what travel you can do. So I think everybody sets it differently. People find out what we pay people because they talk to each other, etc. We're also prepared to negotiate in certain circumstances. So if somebody's got to come from outside of Delhi and find a place to share, we'll help them try and find a place to share. But at the same time, we understand that their expenses will be higher.
Okay. Considering I have just recently done both, which is be an employed, salaried person. And in the last year is when I've been independent. I do currently have 8 income streams for this sustainability.
You said 8.
8. If you count, yeah, it's 8. And that literally is what's making it possible. What may not be visible from me just saying that, okay, there are 8 income streams, which matches that one salaried employability. I'm also someone that's been working full-time for 5 years, and I've studied for 5 years. So there is that to keep into account, that I am in a 5-year cycle right now. So that's still emerging and young to look at that what you had just drawn in the graphic. I think you're adequately correct about the privilege and access. I think this would be incredibly difficult to do if I had to support anyone other than myself. I'll be very honest about that. Because I have to only support myself, this is possible. If I had to pay for someone else, anyone else, I would have continued in my former job for a longer time to be able to transition more smoothly. I definitely want to add that there is a middle management filter of a sort. So for example, if I'm in my early 20s, suddenly there's a big gap, 30s and 40s, you don't see anyone, and then suddenly you see someone in their 50s. They're fine because they've kind of just stuck it through some way or the other. So then you have this nice little golden pool at the top, maybe. I hope it's there. But when you're kind of rising in this middle management is when you're most tempted to leave because it is quite difficult. I think that, as Jagdip said, highly employable. So if this was in any other sector, I know I'd easily be earning 2 to 3 times more. So I've always advised in any kind of training session or career session I've ever taken in any university, for any artists, college ever, is that this also is possible because I'm passionate and I'm paying just for myself. But that's also never going to be enough. This passion has to translate into tangible salaries, whether I'm getting it from 8 streams or whether I'm getting it from 1. But it has to be living, breathing costs that you can actually build a career over. So I'm at 8 right now. That is my reality. I don't have a solution here, but just to tell you this is where I'm at.
I think, Radha, just to sort of gently go into that, and I think it sort of ties in really well. You've heard much more formal organization perhaps can pay slightly better than, most not-for-profits, and you were sharing your experience of how difficult it is for not-for-profits to think about pay scales and pay an adequate amount because of the funding structures. Would you like to share a little bit of that just for people to get an understanding of how these work and what kind of decisions have to be taken in order to put down certain slabs, especially when it comes to the kind of funding that you receive for your projects?
So, I mean, just on the outside, if you think you're going to be working in the arts or culture and make money, and that's your impulse to enter it, don't do that. no one does anything in this because their first thing is, hey, I want to make a bunch of money. And I don't think that's typically the impulse. I think I've almost never met anyone who's like, yeah, I did this in the arts because I thought I'll make a quick buck, or even like. So I think that's there. So there's obviously something that's drawing you towards it. I think I truly believe it might take longer, but you're able to monetize it if you stick to it. So it is a bit of finding that sweet spot of your interest and what you're good at, with a bit of knowledge of what you're not good at, what you particularly don't like but are good at. I think it's somewhere a constant struggle between these two. But I think if you have an interest in something enough and you can sustain it, eventually you'll be able to monetize it. You will not be a millionaire or even half a millionaire or 1/10 a millionaire, but you'll be able to sustain yourself, I think. So I think I believe that. And I think with not-for-profits, it's even more complicated because, especially in India, you don't have any state funding. You are dependent on cultural diplomacy funding. You're dependent on international funding cycles. You're dependent on a patronage which is not that big, and there are increasingly a lot more foundations reaching out to the same few set of people or foundations. So, and these all come with kind of success indicators against which you have to, show a project planning. And almost all of them, if at all they factor in administrative costs, they come with a ceiling cap of like maybe 20%. I think the highest I've seen is 20%. So there is no scope actually to kind of build in this kind of salaries that you need. And actually that's one of the things that we've been constantly fighting, not fighting, but kind of jostling with our funders and in general bringing that up, is that if you want good quality projects executed, you need good people leading them. You need to be able to retain them. There's a reason why in general art spaces have a very high attrition rate. And I think that has to be combated by factoring these things in. So while we may be a not-for-profit, financial sustainability is actually extremely important for us to think and plan for.
You know, it's interesting that you bring that in, Shaleen, please. But I just want to touch upon one thing that you spoke about is generally when we talk about running any kind of organization, because we've recently started running a for-profit small service consultancy, we're told that your expenses have to be like your administrative expenses have to be at least not more than 40%. So when you're saying it's 20%, that's actually half of what anybody who's running any kind of an organization feels it should be. So that's an interesting sort of perspective to look at. The other thing that I'm thinking about is, earlier when we spoke about the structure of the sector, we said there are different kinds of organizations, but we are talking about a for-profit, a not-for-profit, and a government-run organization within the same sector, which is not the same as the not-for-profit sector. The not-for-profit sector, which is the larger social impact sector, for the want of a better word, can afford to pay people better than, from what I'm hearing, even the arts sector. So I'm just thinking about those intersectionalities that perhaps we could think about as well for us collectively, that we may, we might have to look at a different lens to talk about funding or surviving in the not-for-profit part of the culture sector. Yeah.
One other thing that I find, like for example, is that having been a freelance editor at some point in time, is that actually it's possible to make all these kind of, like a gig economy also work for you and something else, but everything comes with its pros and cons. So for example, while there was a time when I was making maybe twice the amount of money I make at the moment, there was a precarity about when I would be paid. When will I be actually able to get that check that's being promised to me for a really long time? Or when will I be adequately compensated for the 3 rounds of edits that I was supposed to make when we were contractually obliged to only do 1? The fact that I even was making contracts at all. So I think, and that way, that kind of a stability exists with a full-time job. And I think that's one of the most remarkable things for Khoj, is that I think Pooja and the finance team have worked very hard to ensure that there's never a delay in salaries, or that you're never not able to people's salaries. So I think those come, and I know some friends of mine, for example, who work in other kinds of not-for-profits, which are attached to cultural diplomacy wings, for example, they have other kinds of perks, which come with certain kind of per diems, other kind of privileges. And I think there are other kinds of metrics also. So the fact that you get to represent an institution or a project, go to visit other places, I mean, those are the other kinds of ways, and I would factor those in thinking about pay scales.
Definitely have to address 2 points about how freelancers figure out how to demand a pay, or what they should be paid. I've been at it for just 1 year. There are many more qualified people in the audience actually who can answer this better. But having said that, that's a sweet spot between sector agnosticism and sector specificity with your skill. So keeping in mind my former role, which is sales within contemporary art, for that itself, I can demand a really, really good amount. That I'm not choosing to deal with sales puts that completely out of my income stream. So then it becomes that within contemporary art itself, because that is now my area of specialization, and programming within institutions, which is also my area of specialization, are like the golden eggs for me. And then you have, as you already know, that my profile is very generalist and diverse. So then it becomes lesser and lesser or more inconsistent. But then you have to recognize yourself where it is that you can demand the most and what you can tangibly show you've delivered results in before in that industry. I definitely have to add the biggest change is that in a salaried employee structure, your loyalty remains only to one entity. And to shift to an agnostic structure where you have to work with everybody, you have to maintain relationships with everybody, is a different changing of gears, which is very important for you to survive independently. And with a lot of pride, I think the first thing I did with the first show I ever curated was myself and the gallery and the gallerist I curated that show for sat down with independent lawyers. I sat down with mine, she sat down with hers. And we drafted the first contract between an independent curator and a gallery. Because one thing that independent consultants, independent professionals, whatever you are, forget that you also have to be legally protected. Legally also, I'm using it very loosely. You have to just be protected. by certain terms and conditions. And for independent entities, there's nothing. And I can't simply just join freelancers, film. No offense, but yeah, I still can't join that because there is nothing for me here. So that effort has to be made. So that contract making is one of the biggest gaps that independent professionals need to address to protect when you're being paid, how many checks you need to do, when do you have to send your invoices, when do you expect a check, which bank account is it going to go from, and what are the terms and conditions, roles and responsibilities. It's so fluid and based on relationship and word of your work, which isn't enough in an already fluid sector. So contracts was one that I had to highlight.
So, I mean, it's interesting because moved from precarity to essentially talking about how you navigate these very tricky situations and how much of professionalism is needed and also validated. I think it's important enough for us to celebrate this. I have one more question before we open it up to the audience because I know we're edging towards our closing time. Alessandro, I know we've discussed about ROI. And given that these realities exist where there's precarity, where you have not-for-profit organizations who might not be able to pay, commercial, the way a corporate structure would pay, and also you're perhaps some ambiguity on pay scales. If someone wants to look at doing a degree in the arts, how would or should they look at ROI given these realities that exist?
I think that financial ROI is very difficult, but following what Radha was saying, there are other things in the art sector that drive you and that are very important. We always say, just for saying that being happy and being able to pursue your passion is the best richness you can have, it's part of it. Okay, I understand that then we have to survive, but we have to consider that. We have to consider that also that, first of all, we always speak about for-profit, not-for-profit. I don't see not-for-profit, okay? Because while the structure might not allow you to get money out, but nowadays everything has to be dealt as for-profit, and the profits, you just keep them inside to reinvest and make anything scalable, because nowadays getting just money thrown away by patrons is getting more and more difficult. And in India, it's needed to have this money, for sure, for what you were saying before, what people are ready to pay. So we have to find a way to make profits that are not taken out. And that by pursuing, for example, one of the, we say that we have passion and money. On the other side, we have revenues and the social impact that art has to have. Okay, in most of the countries, this has been recognized by law, that if you manage an art institution, you have to impact the community around you, and that can be done by generating revenues. So the Badaji Lab, for example, have focused on kids, and they are making revenues on that and other areas. So I think a bit of both. We have to see. For sure, you will not become a millionaire, at least not a short term, but again, it's a sector that is changing a lot with many big areas, pockets of opportunities that are opening.
Thank you for that. And with that, we'd like to open it up for Q&A.
I've got one observation and a couple of questions for you. I think first things first, it's interesting everyone frames it as the art sector. I would also suggest you view it as the art economy. A little bit less.
If we can try and keep it to questions, and even if you have comments, let them be 1 or 2 lines. That would be really helpful.
I'll be very brief. So I would just say it would be worth everybody thinking about it, because a lot of the stuff we've talked about is in commercial terms. I would agree. It's the art economy as well, and it's economy in commercialism tends to be a bit of a dirty thing. You know, we associate it with capitalism and so on and so forth, but I think the opportunities ultimately where the broader economy grows, the arts economy grows as well. With that being said, a question to each of you or any of you, what excites you most about your career and the opportunities, say, in the next 5 years to come within the India art scene? Thank you.
I'm very passionate about teaching about the arts and the art economy. So I think in the next 5 years, I'm geared to, very passionate about, and eagerly looking forward to teaching South Asian relevant arts education. That is what's driving me right now.
Well, in 5 years' time, I'll be retiring. So for me, the most important thing is that there will be a group of people that I trained who had shared values, who contributed to the things that we wanted to achieve, and that they have forged good, successful careers for themselves, and they're bringing in with the people that they then hire and they then train, which for me the most important thing when I came was that the art sector here was the creation of art, the creativity was incredibly dynamic, but not many people appreciate it in India and internationally, and if more people get to see it and there's more appreciation of that, then that for me, raising standards, quality, my job is done.
Actually, I'm using the art sector over art economy very deliberately because I think the word art economy, the phrase, leaves out a lot of people and reduces capital to a very simplistic flow. And I actually demand it to be a sector because then it has a wider stakeholdership of a lot of people who follow outside of the artist, gallery, collector relationship. And it also demands a certain kind of professionalism from systems, equations, relationships. So I'm actually consciously using that a lot more. What's exciting for me personally is actually two things. One is that I love organizing and managing things, and I'm seeing that it's possible to do that. But also more interestingly, curatorially speaking, I'm very interested in pursuing my practice, which is outside of exhibition making. And I think there's a lot of space and potential for that.
And then there is Narayana, and I saw one hand up here.
Hi, thank you. How does one make an entry in this sector?
Well, if you're, are you coming from a student level or, well, in that case, if you go to the India Art Fair website, you'll see that we have a core team of 15, it's gone up to 25, but we're hiring for short term about 77 people to work with us over the course of a week over a fair, is to actually get some experience, is to get some hands-on experience, be prepared to do whatever you can that is asked of you, which is legal, but it gives you an opportunity also to be in an environment where you can get to see a lot of art, and you can see and experience some of the talks program, etc. But essentially, you're there to do a job. It's like being somebody who's doing security at a football or cricket match. You have your back to the ground, but actually the fact that you're there means something, and you learn while you're there.
Volunteering and internship actually is one of the key ways, especially now a lot of big festivals and events have that. I think
Biennale is the same. I mean, they hire hundreds of people. We hire about 80 extra people. So everything from information desk to supporting accessibility to assisting in a live project that's going on to things that may sound quite mundane, but actually that's how you learn, and then you don't have to pay for a ticket.
I would also say, like this page that Rashmi manages, actually, I think it's one of the most incredible resources, which is still somewhat informal on Facebook. It's, I think, called the Arts and Art.
To anybody who can say the full one.
Jobs, opportunities, careers in the arts and something.
Arts Culture Association.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But it's become like this wonderful aggregator of a lot of open calls for short-term, full-time opportunities in the broader art space. And probably the only one that exists of its kind.
And you're on social media as well, promoting those.
And for the time, say you are interested in a certain organization, but there is no open call. I mean, just assume that it's a rolling application. So initiate yourself. I got my first 2 jobs by badgering the person who eventually hired me. So I got it off a newspaper advertisement, badgered them. The other one, I just wrote emails and kept writing till I got the response I wanted. So there's that too, because sometimes if it won't be clear, there's no HR, so you won't have like a direct, this is where I need to apply to send my CV sometimes. So just initiate and go for it.
So I just want to add two more things to that. One is, as you said, Arts, Culture, Resources India. We started city chapters now, so it's not in Delhi yet, but a lot of people have inquired. There's Bombay, Bangalore, and Pune, where every 2 to 3 months we do either a networking session, a presentation, or a workshop. The next major one is going to be in Bangalore on strategic planning, which is actually by a SDA Bocconi professor. That's going to happen in March. But aside from that, British Council has also been running a series of events called Festival Connections, which is a space for learning and networking for festival managers. So there are avenues where you can meet, like I would encourage that talk to everyone who's here. I know there are several people here who would be, interesting for you to talk to and see what the scoping is. So events of this sort where the sector comes together would be a much more informal but a direct way to get to know what kind of opportunities exist. There's one Festivals Connection events that happening tomorrow, focused on festivals and connect, since we spoke about festivals and things of that sort. Currently, according to me, it's one of the easiest ways to enter the sector today. So just that one. There was a question there, Narayan. You had a mic?
Hi. So my question is regarding the pay scales again, or the speculation of how the cultural sector is going to progress in the next 5 to 10 years. Because, so I come from a social sector. I have had a 5-year experience in social sector. Then I had the opportunity to do the EPAM course, the International Arts Management. Post which now I am a freelancer who does some bit of theater facilitation and art consulting. But when I look at it in the long-term perspective, I'm still not able to get a very bright picture of how this sector is going to help me grow as an individual in my professional career. And also looking at the kind of political progress that we as a country are making, or as a planet we are making, I think I would like to understand what are the kind of opportunities and what are the kind of threats as a culture sector that we are facing.
So is that one question or two questions? And just to sort of, are you talking about trend forecasting in the culture sector as to what is going to happen that will be interesting in the culture sector? That was one of your questions, yeah. But the second one was the political, the role that it's going to play in the larger political narrative?
No, I think it's more the first question with respect to the kind of political scenario we are in.
Okay, is that clear?
Well, what I would say is that there's always a level of uncertainty and job uncertainty in every sector. If you're a freelancer, unlike an employee, employees still also have a level of uncertainty in job longevity, because particularly in commercial organizations, because if things change, the economy changes or the sector changes in a particular way, it can lead to job losses very quickly. But for me, I think somebody said it here earlier, normally when an economy grows, the creative economy grows as well. So it's also about finding the opportunities and not being too narrow about it. We know a number of artists who work as graphic designers and have actually started their careers that way. We also know people who work in theatre, but they also have a part-time job doing something else. So it's about creating some certainty for yourself as far as is possible so that you can ride out the waves. But I would say the sector here is very, very dynamic. And there are more people setting up theatre groups. There are more private museums being set up. It's said that the government wants to do more with the national museums and the national spaces, and that's something you just have to wait and see. But there are places that have new, like the Bihar Museum, etc., places where people are looking for employees, but not many young people want to go and work. But it's just something, you create as much certainty as you can for yourself, and it sometimes means that you can't do the kind of jobs that you might want to do.
I'm trying to answer the same for myself, so I rely on a lot of reading of certain kind of reports to understand the trends myself. Few of the resources I can immediately share are actually a lot of work that Rashmi does, which is impact assessment reports for a lot of festivals that take place, which is hugely important to read and understand. Arts and philanthropy is one, art tactic is one. Now these are actual reports that are made assessing the entire year, and if you read many together, that's one way to equip yourself in trying to understand this, because there is no one formal organization that's going to give you, this is the trend forecasting for the culture sector. In addition to that, the government actually hires a lot of private citizen consultants. So that's one area to explore. Read all government reports, budget reports. That's how I'm educating myself. I don't have a direct answer yet. But if... Do I need to answer? No, I think...
Indiaculture.nic.in will have most of the government reports, and it's quite a big. So there was a question here. Someone had raised hand.
Okay, hi. I actually have two questions. One is for Shaleen. So you said that, it would have been a little, it's easy for you to support yourself because you have to only support yourself and the passion is still there. It's just a question that came to my mind. Had it been a scenario where you had someone else also to take care of, but you had your passion to also nurture for your own self. So is it very difficult for somebody who's actually associated with someone else and wants to go ahead with the passion? I mean, it's just a gray area for me to understand. I mean, I want to look at it. I personally am a professional coming from a whole different background and who would want to explore this and would want to seriously consider this. As Radha said, that everybody comes out of a place where they have a passion in this. I do have it, and this passion is wanting me to consider this profession, but then there are other limitations, and what you said really struck a chord with me. So I would want to know, I mean, how does anybody, navigate their way through this, had they don't have only themselves to support? Just a question.
Okay. I also think others should chime in. I'm only 5 years down in a career cycle. I'd like to reiterate that. But I did say this when I was talking about it, that if I had someone else to support, I would have been in my former job for a longer time, which was sales within the arts sector, which was definitely more stable than what I'm doing right now. I would have stayed in that for longer. So that's, off the bat, that's definitely what I would have done. Keeping your case in mind, which is something I advise when I do a lot of career sessions where I get people who are transitioning or want to transition, is that you have to be comfortable with the idea of flexi time, because the arts industry sector works on the weekends as well. So there is a way for you to be able to balance and dedicate hours within the week to be able to have an association with an organization, at least to begin with. So that definitely is the answer that I can provide right now, but if anyone else wants to chime in, please.
I would just say that maybe try to further locate when you think about passion, where does it come to? Is it a particular kind of art viewing or a content or a context, or it could be a bit of both or all three that you are interested in, and then try to pursue it. Because I think, I like to think of art as when you look at it as a larger ecosystem or landscape, much the way people are looking at maybe the social impact space or even academia and humanities, that it is tied to a very intangible something. The only difference in the arts is that often it can be tangibly quantified in terms of a deliverable, whether it's an exhibition or a biennale or an art fair or a museum show or a publication or a piece of art writing or a fundraising proposal. So, and I think that's where there is potential to kind of maybe do multiple things. Like I personally keep trying to see, okay, what are the things that I like to do and enjoy and I'm good at? What are the things I'm good at but I hate? And what are the things that I don't know enough about but I'm interested in? And I think there is a possibility. And I think if you are able to kind of pursue your specific passion and kind of open it up a bit more, eventually maybe you can make money off it. But there are multiple other things that you can do which you're good at, but maybe they're not your primary focus, which can help sustain this interest. There's no one way of, I think, locating yourself in this space.
I just want to add something because Alessandro had touched upon that, is adaptability. Is the ability to adapt both in the specialism and the generalist and connect it to passion and what you're good at but may not be as passionate about. So just to give you, as even Jagdip was saying, theatre people. I mean, I know tons of really amazing, well-regarded, they come in papers almost every other day, who do corporate training as well. And they earn reasonably well. So I feel like those avenues exist and they are very, very strong because, face it, we need innovation today to survive. Who's coming with that? People with this level of creativity and passion and initiative and the ability to adapt. The great thing about the arts is our ability to be resilient So that's something that, I mean, I know that there's a lot of very interesting negative slides that we've spoken about, pay scales and things of that sort, but actually there's a reason why all of us are here, because it's amazing. There's a lot going on, and it's pretty much the only sector that can survive. We're, sorry for this, but we sort of could be the cockroaches in case there is there is an apocalypse at some point of time. The only ones who will survive. The resilience is what makes us stronger. So that's one thing to think about in terms of what they've said. There is one question here. And it'd be great if we could limit it to a question. There was one question there. The gentleman with the jacket, yes.
So thank you very much for allowing me to speak. And my first question to you, Rashmi, is, so the white paper that you've done, I would really love to know what was the survey base that was taken as to who was interviewed and what was the quality and the number. So if it is already online, you can probably just share and we'll just go online and check it out. I'm an engineer, and so I've moved into the arts 10 years back. And in terms of the courses that you were talking about, so all of us in the front bench, we are all part of this new course by Indira Gandhi National Center for Arts. So they've started this postgraduate diploma in cultural management. And so it was quite interesting, And so we are also, this is the first time that they've introduced it, and we're also, they're learning, we are learning, and just the first semester to come to the end of it. But I think the paucity of genuinely good cultural managers is definitely what I feel as an insider as well. I think it exists. There's so much more that can be done if we have better people in terms of skills and the numbers as well. I just want to ask, so one question was to you, and the main question that I want to ask the panel here is, the sector or the industry itself, it's very unstructured. What sensibly can we do as a collective thing? So individually Khoj is doing, in the art fair, obviously quite structured. Even amongst the freelancers, I think there is a lot of unstructured. How can we kind of, support this to become a little more structured? Is there a way to do it?
One of the things that we've been talking about for a while, and somebody here have been talking about it as well, is that for us as an art fair, it would be helpful to us, but also helpful for people who are employed in the sector, is for there to be an association, a gallery association, which means that there can be some protocols or guidelines around certain things, but it also means that when we as a fair want to send a message to potential applicants to partake in the fair or apply for the fair, then we're able to get those messages through this association. We can also present about our plans for the future. It's very difficult to go out and present to any number of people. One of the reasons we can kind of push for it is to say that if people are not members of the Galleries Association, because we have set criteria about who can apply, and I'm not talking about an expensive venture, I'm talking about something where a gallery might pay, say, 5,000 rupees a year to be a part of, is that we can say that we will only accept applications from members of the Gallery Association because they have passed certain criteria in order to be members of that association, very light criteria as well. So in that way we can push for certain things to happen. So I think that is something very important. I think there's some other things that have happened in the sector which are affecting a number of sectors, which relates to sexual harassment and various other things that have come up at work. And I think that when you have these, even if they're quite loose associations, it is also a way for people to come and talk to each other and decide how one should deal with issues going forward and have more of a collective understanding of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, instead of sitting in little silos and kind of wondering who's thinking what and not really doing anything about it. So in that way there are some things we can kind of push for a bit more collaboration. Also, the one thing, I know you do it very well, is if there was a Galleries Association, they could also run a recruitment board, because we put things on social media. I've seen so many art prizes, so many grants for different things. Deadlines are extended because people aren't applying because they aren't aware of them. None of us can afford to advertise and on television and tell people about them. So it means that the Galleries Association could do that, and also in things like changes to tax rules, a variety of things. So everybody benefits.
Just want to add another layer to that, which would be like which every industry has, every other structured industry, which would be like a cultural workers union, without the heavy connotation of the word union, but just everyone, a cultural professional, which is arts, heritage, whatever, crafts, wherever, like basically a agnostic sort of large organization of everyone who's working in this space. So if there's a formalized, internally recognized cultural workers union, then people can just come together. So.
I would just take maybe one step back, and I would say it just requires a lot more of collectivism and transparency and more conversations. I think that's one of the things that was a bit surprising for me, is that the kind of like, it's not even intentional gatekeeping, but it ends up happening because there's not enough talking happening outside of our immediate circle. And that circle is also often not your own doing, but what you've inherited by virtue of the context in which you've been currently working. And I think what's great is that I think increasingly I see a lot more younger people much younger than even me, joining. And I think there's a lot more conversation over there. So actually I think it's only going to get better and better. I would also like to say that maybe we need to think of structure and professionalism in a very different way, and not just apply what we see in other kind of spaces directly to it. Because I think one of the biggest kind of workforce is actually people working in freelance spaces. And not all of them are working because they can't get a full-time job. A lot of them are doing it because they actually are prioritizing a certain kind of freelance work over a full-time job, which comes with its own other things. So I would just, and I think so actually the big thing for me would be that we should just have more conversations. And I think they're happening already.
Yeah, and just to add to that, some of what is being spoken about, I know it's under works. So in the next 1 year, I think some of this will be a reality. Watch out for what's going on. Just a couple of more additions to that is, I know that FICCI and CII have formal committees where they are trying to get people together. It's still very top heavy as opposed to bottom up. But again, a space for you to watch out, particularly because you're in Delhi. We're very far away in other cities. We don't have that kind of access to the intelligence that's going on within these conversations at all times. But you being here might have that. The second thing I would strongly recommend, because I often do that, is just go to the Government of India websites and keep an eye out for all the papers they're putting out, because they're constantly putting out comments for public consultations. And there are so many of these draft consultations and policies that just go up without enough public commentary. So we don't know, and it is happening. So that's another thing I'd urge you to, both on a central level as well as your local level, understand what the interjections are for cultural engagement with the state, to be able to engage with that better. And about the survey, I think you probably came in a little late, it was already covered, so we can talk about it after. Yeah? Okay. He has the mic, and then you.
So actually, Radha answered largely to the question I had, so I'll make it short. What about the collectivism? What about to be part of something that is larger than individual, a culture? Every segment of society, every age group, every individual is part of a larger culture or several different other cultures. And we discussed today a lot about how you sustain a career in art management, and one fuel that I find very important is pleasure and the capacity to be part of something, to define a culture. Because at the end of the day, it will be carried after us as individual, on generations, and as we say, it's a sector that is very flexible, constantly changing. That's interesting. I would really like to know what is your opinion about what culture you want to define.
Well, I think for me and my organisation, I think I can speak for us, I think we have a common shared value, which is we believe that art can, it sounds a bit cheesy, but that it can improve people's lives, and it's very important to people's mental health as much as anything else, and that art should be accessible to all. So through the fair, what we do is we're a commercial entity, and we do as much as that we can to also promote as many art platforms and other putting in events and talk programs and what have you, so that make them accessible to people, not just to ticket buyers who come to the fair, but also this year extending by having those activities also happen in public spaces. We use the website because we want as many people as possible to have an opportunity to experience and learn some of the stories. It's one of the reasons we make short films, so people can learn about some of the artists and their stories and bios. And even though they may never come to the fair, it means that people across India and around the world are getting to learn about how fantastic Indian art is, South Asian art. And for me, that's my heritage. So you can imagine it's something I'm very proud of.
Art and culture, I think, is again very philosophical. Is in everyone, accessible. I think one of the other things is that it's hugely democratic. There is no single person who can't draw. So you have a natural affinity to art. You're born with it, is what I believe. So you're born with it. You can appreciate it. You can fall in love with it. You can practice it. You can view it. So that's precisely the culture that should exist. And definitely in times like now, where we have the political environment that we do, it needs to exist free, fair, and democratically, and hugely accessible, which it is. I just want to drive that point forth.
Oh, I think all our answers are very cheesy, but maybe there's something there. I think just to further that a bit in the cheesy factor, I think what's interesting for me in my personal experience and from a little bit that I've seen is that there is a capacity for the creative practices, and I will not singularly isolate contemporary art, but I mean all kinds of creative practices, that they can affect you in a way that can move you beyond me sitting down and telling you that, look what's happening. And that affective power is what makes a culture. So a culture is nothing but perhaps a collective shift in the way we are seeing the same thing. And I think that is like the driving force for us, that exists. And to extend that to our own practice, I think for me, two things that come out of that which are very important. One is that therefore this kind of art making cannot exist in an echo chamber, serving a certain kind of exhibition practice, talking to people who are already speaking that language, but needs to kind of break out of that. And the second thing is to practice the politics that the art is espousing. So how are we being inclusive? How are we being fair? How are we being transparent in our own institutional workings, in our own practices ourselves? To hold ourselves accountable to the same things that we hold our artists or our artworks accountable to.
We'll just take one last question because we are really
Hello. I just had this question about, in your presentation you have mentioned how, as part of your interviews, you have found that often there were talks about people bringing up the issue about inadequate pay for the positions or for the work they're doing. I wanted to ask you that in a workplace or in an institution, it's a very sensitive topic to talk about pay and to talk about one's worth. So I wanted to ask that as art workers and art administrators, if we feel that maybe we're not paid adequately, of course I have felt that we are expected to work for art's sake, passion, for the sake of your own passion or whatever. So I want to ask, how do we then communicate this to the institutions without having them feel that, okay, maybe we are attacking you? How do we create this dialogue? I mean, I'm not just talking about institutions in institutions. I'm also talking about cultural centers, not necessarily Indian cultural centers. Maybe Italian cultural center. So I'm just giving an example. So I just wanted to broach this subject. How does one talk about one's worth and translate it into remuneration and pay? Like this conversation.
Well, I think in our organisation, we're a small organisation, but we have 15 employees, and then we hire people on for shorter term arrangements is that if somebody wants to talk about their pay, they come and talk to me about it. It's as simple as that. And we listen and we look at the reasons for it. And also, you know, when we're in a good financial position, everybody benefits. And when we have to tighten our belts a little bit, we do that. But one of the other things we do think about is when we're not in a position necessarily to increase somebody's pay, it's about the other benefits. So funding travel, allowing them to be going to serendipity, for example, or Kochi, making them part of other activities that they wouldn't normally in their role get to be a part of. But like I said, I mean, two of my employees are here. If they got something, you know, it's one thing that's really important because it has such an emotional impact of people and it breeds resentment if people feel that they're not being paid well. The other thing is, in many places, you don't always realize the position that your organization is in and all the pressures that are being carried and all the difficulties that may surround it. And it may be that one sees one thing happening and thinking, oh, we're going to spend all this money on this training or this seminar, and yet I feel I'm being underpaid. So I think we try to make sure that everybody understands what we can or cannot do, and then we do a standard pay rise, percentage pay rise, which we introduced last year across the board. So whatever we agree financially to be the standard pay rise in a percentage terms, which is what happens in many places in Europe, is that what we do. I also did look at in the last 2 years, particularly where I thought that people's salaries were out of sync with what they were actually doing, and then took steps to remedy that. So I think we've got it to a good position at the moment, but it's something that's for constant review. It's not something that somebody in my position can discuss every day, but when people want to discuss it, I think you have to let them speak then, because otherwise it will fester.
I've not been good at it, that's something I can admit. This is very, very difficult and uncomfortable in a salaried environment for sure, because you're a small organization. So everyone's aware of what kind of conversations you're having. Everyone knows who's earning what. I mean, it's unwise to think otherwise. Former conversations in salaried structures have always been discomforting. From that one worry every year, I now have price negotiations every week. So the first word that came to my mind when you talked about worth is the imposter syndrome. It takes a lot of changing your own idea of your own worth, which is a self journey, which really has to happen. Buffet that with what are people with your skill sets in other industries being paid, because your industry standard is not a good enough response from the other side ever. Because the arts industry standard of paying is shit. So that has to change. It's going to take time. In addition to that, when it comes to how I negotiate prices now, I have done a lot of work at prices which were throwaway. And now, after a lot of mistakes, and repeated mistake after repeated mistake, have I actually arrived at an idea of my worth, and I'm also affordable, but it's not me working for peanuts independently. But that's also taken more than a year. And after reaching a certain point, I'm now in a secure enough position to let a project go if it doesn't meet my price. But it's taken a while. And sometimes I'd still blink in a staring competition and I'd still take it even if the value is a lot more, exposure is a lot more, blah, blah, blah. But the price is still not met. I'd still do that. Very, very few pay your worth when you're independent. So it takes a while to get to that level. I'm still, again, a year down, so.
Thank you for your question. I think it's a very important question. I really think so. And I think it's something we need to speak about a lot more. Informally, formally, collectively, in all possible ways. I think the fact that you're thinking this means that you've reached some kind of a precipice. That happened to me. When you come to a realization that, okay, listen, there's something wrong happening over here, and then you address it, and you confront in the way that best suits you. And I think that's like my personal learning. Like, I prefer emails, for example. I prefer writing my things down and then sending them in a formal way. I like researching things and making an argument for certain things. So I think figure out what is your best way that you find, because what the issue that you're asking about is not just professional issue. It also it interfaces very personally with who you are and who you're speaking with. And I mean, that's something that I think human relationships and PR is one of the most critical, fragile things that is very, very important to being in the arts. And so I think work with that. I would also say that it helps to kind of break down the work that you're being made to do and the kind of invisible labor that you're putting into things, which is not being acknowledged and therefore not being factored in. I also think that because on the whole the sector is still upcoming, and the fact that we are still used to very old kind of pay scales or a certain attitude towards what a certain job is worth giving money to, it actually helps everybody, including your employer perhaps, to ask those questions. Because I've also seen that people haven't considered certain other factors, which come from many, many reasons. But so it helps to have that conversation. If you can't do it alone, try to go in a group. Try to encourage more transparency amongst your colleagues and peer group to be at least honest with each other about things. Where you don't think you can be compensated in money, try to be compensated in other perks, even if that means doing lesser work hours. There are ways to, and I think it always helps to know what's your hard no, and stick to that. Again, it's a precarious thing because often we're not in a position to say no because your financial stability is so dependent on even that little bit of money. So I don't think there's a real answer, but think about who you are, what you're comfortable with, and what you're not.
I'm also going to add one of the ways to understand worth, which keeps getting rewired and recomputed every time. It's not just only the years of work, it's also what you've studied before. That adds to the quantum of what you can do. Because there'll of course be someone who can do it better or worse, and there will be someone who can do the same thing. Your quantum is how fast you can do it. I think that's something we really, really miss. It's about what I can do faster than the other person who will be hired for a lesser cost. That's probably like my one major takeaway for this year. More?
I am very conscious of the time, so this is something we'll have to discuss outside. So this was supposed to be the X factor, which is what is the gap between a good and a great arts manager, and perhaps that worth context could also come in there. What can you demand when you feel you've gotten to the stage of this is the value I'm adding? And it would be great to have these conversations outside and unpack that a little more. Just to give you a quick run through about the next steps. No surprises, we'll be publishing the white paper very soon. Next month, it'll be out. And because we have all your email IDs, if we don't have it, please give it outside. It'll come to your inboxes. And one more slide after that is we have another event tomorrow at the new IKEA space in Dhanmil called Space 10. It's a conversation with festival managers and leaders talking about how do we ensure diversity and inclusion in festivals. So please come to that. And finally, just wanted to say a big thank you to our panelists for coming to this space with such openness and honesty. It is a cloistered sector. It's not very open for understandable reasons, but thank you for helping us orient around what is going on and unpacking this. A big thank you also to all of you, of our audience members. I know it's not easy to talk about ideas of worth and to scratch the surface and think about which direction do you want to go in as far as your career is concerned or the choices that you make. So thank you for bringing that kind of honesty here today and for sharing that with us. Hope that continues. This is just the start of that conversation. We hope to do many more, so please stick on and continue. And finally, a big thank you to our teams, the Italian Cultural Center for the venue, SDA Bocconi for so kindly agreeing to my badgering about we must do research about this. So thank you so much for that. I hope all of you have got the brochures. The IPAM program call is out. Do take a look at that. Training programs are far and few in between. Please let us know about the IGNU program. I'd like to know, just to sort of expand the space, look at possibilities of collaborations and learning between each other. And thank you to the technical team here for recording, making sure the PowerPoint doesn't go off midway, and Sumit and Dipti and Sukita, thanks so much for your support. That's the team that was working on this. So thank you once again.